When I was little, my mother said my father was from a country that no longer existed. My father was a Baltic refugee from Soviet-occupied Latvia. I was born here in the magical year of 1984. Well, now Latvia exists again, thank God, and 1984 has given way to this brave new world. My father's family was divided by the Cold War, and it is from my family and work that I've learned about aggression and resistance. I'm a photographer and writer, and I've spent the last decade in and out of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. I lived in Azerbaijan, then in Turkey. In both countries, I watched as autocrats emerged to suck the oxygen out of their societies. In the past few years, in the US, I have focused on the topic of police brutality, and specifically one ugly, 2-decade-long case of police torture on the south side of Chicago. The problem for our nation when such cases emerge is that it becomes much more difficult to make the case that democracy is the best form of government to protect the citizens against the abuses a state is capable of. In recent weeks, we have seen a rollout of Facebook ads created by Russia from groups with names like Blacktivist, Black Matters, Don't Shoot Us. Every police shooting and every police officer who is shot at represents a breakdown in the relationship between the citizens and the state, something the Russians have adeptly pounced on. With active measures, the goal is to divide people through the use of novelty, propaganda, infiltration, and incident. Every day we experience fresh attacks on our country in ways that attack our government, our civil society, our tech sector, and in ways that stay off the front page and are less visible to those not trained to look for them. Controversy is a useful wedge because the visual symbols of the NFL or in Charlottesville are so much easier for most people to grasp. The bent knee, the hand on the heart, the burning torch. This, brilliantly, sinisterly, is what gets covered instead of police brutality and racism. And while this conversation is important socially, culturally, and politically, its appropriation by spectacle creates the camouflage that permits Russian attacks to continue. Pretty soon you become convinced the chimera is real, and you forget about Russia. This is not an accident. Active measures are designed to divide and conquer. Operationally, they pull at fissures. They take existing divisions and exaggerate them. When the president tweets, divisiveness materializes in real life. They say he is a puppet, but in this way, he functions like a puppet master. Some describe active measures as political warfare, but when they are imposed on a population, it is psychological warfare. The goal of active measures is to capture the state and seize it before the population wakes up to the damage. By then, the authoritarian mechanisms are in place, and people can be crushed. Washington has a 3 to 5 year vision of history and capacity for strategic planning. Russia operates on a much longer time frame. Think generations instead of decades. Active measures seek to isolate you. Active measures try to take your head to a space where fear and confusion rule, but you still act in such a way that an outcome Russia desires is possible. Russian military doctrine at present is such that there is no peace and war. War operates on a continuum. Mostly, the goal is to get you to turn against your fellow Americans, then keep your head down and do nothing. In Russia, people are accustomed to living double lives of sorts, albeit not nearly as much as in the past under the glorious lie of socialism. Russians are accustomed to living this double life. They have the interior life and the public life. The public life keeps its head down, obeys instructions, avoids interactions with the police and the state. The private life, the stories told in the kitchen, the view one has of oneself, this is all often in conflict with the private life. In the mind of a Russian citizen who has never lived safely and securely in freedom, this tension creates fear. In Americans, it can also create fear. but it can give life to other things. The Vietnam generation is the generation the Soviet-era KGB eyed as being the most promising in their eyes. If you listen to the defectors of the late Soviet era, this is what they will tell you. They will say that the generation that tore itself apart along political and racial lines will be capable of dividing itself again. The Vietnam generation mistrusted government, and they tore each other apart along these political and racial lines. That war literally divided a generation. We have not been so divided again until recently. This is not an accident. All those, or excuse me, many of those who fought and beat freedom riders, who taunted those who worked to integrate lunch counters, who sent dogs after little girls, they're still alive and among us. And they're old now, so you know they vote. It's true. Sorry. So you know they vote. Hate has an important role to play here, because as the Southern Poverty Law Center points out, hate is an attack on the health of a community. Russia is like cancer in this sense. Fiona Hill, the Russian Eurasia director on the National Security Council, points out that Russia saw a softening of legitimacy and tensions between the elites and the rest of society, because that's all they're ever on the lookout for in theirs. Hill's is the single most important observation to date as to why Russia attacked us when it did. To return to the Vietnam generation for a moment, this was an opportunity Russia saw as once in a generation, if not more, by pulling on the extremes, on the far left and the far right, finding a certain point of nationalist fury where they meet and pulling hard, divisions are exacerbated. Welcome to active measures. The only way to defeat them is through active resistance. Active measures against a population are a smokescreen. This smokescreen creates an illusion, a fog of war. Look behind the curtain. It is designed to irritate those keen on learning the truth. Like Trump, Russia tells so many lies, even the lies reveal further lies. You begin to think that if someone knows the truth, something terrible happened to them, that it must be buried, if not the person with it. So unknowable is the truth. Russians live double lives. They're used to this. This is part of their system. It's what they know. Americans are the opposite. Everyone who came here, or almost everyone, I should say, and I should emphasize that almost, because there's significant population that was forced here, came here to a better life, or they found it when they got here, eventually, after generations. My father's family, as I mentioned, comes from Latvia. Our experience is that progress comes through keeping your head up. I was taught hope never dies. In Russia, by contrast, they say hope dies last. This abusive relationship that's been created with one another is the product of all of this. Americans tore down Confederate statues as a stand-in for the regime because it's what they know about such things from television, whether it's statues of Lenin in Ukraine in recent years or Saddam Hussein in Iraq after the invasion in 2003. The Russian government feared the organizing power of social media and color revolutions. Rather than use these tools to improve their society, which could use it, they reverse engineered them, for their own usually destructive and invariably self-serving purposes. For the most part, the goals of Russian government are very simple, very simple, namely money and power. There are auxiliary things too, like restored national glory and prestige. Revenge is also very important to nation states. The backbone of Russia's political and economic elite, often the same, is the Russian mafia and the mafia state. The government is literally run like a criminal enterprise. and profits from several. Now, here's where I might get a little bit too optimistic, but I think Russian active measures failed, and they failed for good reason. They failed because the Russian leadership has no idea what a free world mind is or how it thinks. Our patterns of fear must be different. Our people are willing to die on the streets for what they believe, not because they want to, they don't, but because they fear their survival depends on it. Our national heroes and myths give life to ordinary people rising above their circumstances to be extraordinary. So, how do you fight back as a regular American? Well, if the goal is to capture the state, know this is three things to the Russian mind: foreign policy, defense, and the economy. Defend our institutions. Everything else must belong to us. In civil society, in the private sector, we could see there is some visible infiltration in media, businesses, think tanks, and elsewhere. We must push back strongly. Be human and think of ways to humanize the domestic opposition. Be skeptical. Social justice is a national security issue. Every police shooting is an attack on our democracy. How can we make the case that democracy is the best form of governance to protect the people against the abuses the state is capable of if we cannot protect our people? How do we show we're united if mobs of white men are beating freedom riders or Freddie Gray is getting bumped around in the back of a paddy wagon? Our state needs protection, but not from our people. And our people should not need protection from the state. As every day feels like a fresh horror, do not forget your anger. Do not forget the country we had. Do not forget the country you want to live in. As a Soviet radio presenter said while reporting on Khrushchev's secret speech, no one can predict the future, but the past is changing before our very eyes. Thank you.